Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Rob Satloff, the director of the Washington Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special event. Every 4 years, the Washington Institute team of experts produces specialized advice for our new administration. This year, we have produced a series of what we call presidential transition memos that cover a wide array of Middle East issues, from everything from how to approach Iran nuclear diplomacy, to politics and strategy in Northwest Africa, to the Arab-Israeli peace process, and U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia. Today, we are bringing together a panel of experts to discuss one of our most recent presidential transition memos. This is on counterterrorism and counterterrorism strategy 20 years after 9/11. I am delighted that we'll be able to produce this paper, which is a fantastic contribution to an emerging important policy issue that I know the Biden administration is grappling with as we speak. The paper is the product of Dr. Matthew Levitt. Matt is the Fromer Wexler Fellow at the Washington Institute and director of our Reinhard program on counterterrorism and intelligence. I am really delighted to be able to turn the program over to Matt to congratulate him on this outstanding achievement and to invite everyone who is participating in this program, wherever you are in the world, to join us if you have comments or questions by using the chat, the Q&A function, if you're on Zoom, and by using the email function, sending a note to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org, and Matt will bring everybody into the conversation as we move to the question and answer portion of today's program. I want to congratulate Matt, thank our donors, the Reinhardts, the Fromer Wexlers, thank all of the Board of Trustees of the Washington Institute for their support of this initiative, and to turn the program over to my colleague, Matt Levitt. Matt.
Rob, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's joining us today. I'm really thrilled to be able to have this launch event for this new study together with two really fabulous experts, Katrina Mulligan, who is the Acting Vice President for National Security and National Security and International Policy, at the Center for American Progress, and has previously been there and done that at the Department of Justice, the National Security Council, National Counterterrorism Center, et cetera, and Chris Costa, who is at the Spy Museum, Executive Director of the International Spy Museum, served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council under the Trump administration, following a 34-year career at the Defense Department, 25 years in the Army working in counterintelligence, human intelligence, special operations, and all that jazz. So we have some tremendous expertise in the panel. And with that, I'm going to jump right into it. For me, this study was pretty difficult. I started my career in Washington working at the FBI headquarters in counterterrorism, and I led the analytical team for Flight 175 in PENPOM, the 9/11 investigation. And so I found myself with an almost knee-jerk reaction to the question of how should we change things 20 years after 9/11 of, we can't change things. We've done pretty well in 20 years of preventing another catastrophic attack on the country. Why would you shake things up? That's really risky. But the more I dug into this, I realized that we actually don't have much of a choice, that the current counterterrorism posture we've created, which has been successful over 20 years, is simply not sustainable. That we do have a very long laundry list of other national and international security issues that demand our attention, that demand our fiscal responsibility, and that at a time of debts and deficits, of COVID-19 and economic issues, of climate and other things that desperately need our attention, we need to figure out a way to rationalize the counterterrorism mission and to make it more sustainable. From the outset, I want to explain that I'm talking primarily about that big expensive piece of it, which is our international footprint. Domestic violent extremism is obviously a tremendously important and current issue, and it should be noted. ADL and others have noted that more people are killed and wounded in domestic violent extremist incidents in this country then by international terrorist elements. And that's something we all need to take very seriously. There are some ramifications from what I'm about to propose, which include things like the need to double down and invest even more on our domestic security, homeland security agencies, because if we are not going to continue this 20 years of forward defense, and we're going to shift it up into a system that relies more on indicators and warning, on intelligence to be able to forewarn us when a group is shifting towards carrying out an attack against the homeland, a group that is not yet interested or capable in doing that, may be developing the interest or the capability to do that. If we're going to shift towards that kinds of indicators and warning, that incurs an element of risk. And if we're not going to be playing offense, we're going to be playing a little bit more defense. We're going to need to invest even more on that homeland security. One of the things that really drove this conversation, as I met with at least 3 or 4 dozen experts in a series of Zoom roundtables, including current and former US government officials, and in particular one with European counterparts, is the fact that we have to be able to counter terrorism at the same time that we are groping with great power and near power, or some people put it, interstate competition. During the previous administration, it was made very, very clear by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and then by the defense strategy that counterterrorism is still one of the primary national security issues, but it's not the top one. In fact, in a 4+1, some people put it 2+3 formula of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea counterterrorism is still up there, but it ranks number 5. And I think that that's not inappropriate, but I also think that there was a tremendous amount of emphasis on this or that counterterrorism or great power competition, instead of a sufficient attention to how we can, as part of our rationalization of our resources, look at that Venn diagram overlap. And there are a lot of places where the overlap is very, very strong. And we're thinking about that overlap could help us direct when and where to dispatch our forces and utilize our resources. Part of that, I would argue, should be not only about where the biggest threat is, but where the most bang for the buck can be found. Sometimes a small investment in counterterrorism assistance to a country for whom counterterrorism is a greater concern than great power competition can help, that's currency, can help get them to help us on that and other issues. Sometimes our failure to step in in a way that will not cost us, will not be a forever war in any sense of the term, will prevent a great power from having an opportunity to step in at what would be very little cost for them. And so we need to take into account the many ways in which counterterrorism and great power competition are complementary as opposed to being mutually exclusive. But as I thought through this big idea, it occurred to me that there are 2 big obstacles that we really need to address head on if we're going to be able to make this kind of a shift, and it will not be easy. The first is, and I should say that, this is an issue, this whole debate is something that has some measure of bipartisan agreement. This conversation goes back decades. You recall that the Bush administration was going to pivot to Asia, and then you had 9/11. You'll recall that under the Obama administration, there was what some in the military refer to as the 360-degree pivot from Africa to Asia. And then Benghazi happened, and more troops ended up in Africa after than were there before in that 360-degree pivot. So we need to think these things through very carefully. But with this measure of bipartisan support, there are 2 things we have to think through. The first is our international relationships. Republicans and Democrats both, using slightly different terms, talk about partnerships. Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State on their first trip right now just wrote a joint op-ed in the Washington Post talking about specifically the force multiplier effect of these partnerships. Previous administrations have talked about by, with, and through. They've talked about moving from a US-led partner-enabled model and flipping it to, wherever possible, a partner-led and US-enabled model. We have very unique capabilities, whether it's ISR and other types of intelligence, whether it's mid-air refueling, whether it's different types of logistics that we can bring to the fore, as we have, for example, in Africa, supporting the French and others in Operation Barkhane. But to do that, I think we have to come to terms with the fact that we're going to have to deal with the credibility problem. When President Trump several times, woke up in the morning and tweeted, "We're out of Syria," that really shook our allies. I was in the capital of one of our closest European allies that December when he first made that decision. And I was in those buildings and I saw firsthand just how shaken they were. We need to demonstrate that we are a reliable long-term partner on these missions if we're going to really shift the paradigm to one that asks these partners to do a lot more. And when we are thinking about how we should support them, I argue in the paper, there's plenty of need still for military and other kinetic counterterrorism assistance, but we need to move in a very, very concerted fashion away from a position that is military focused to a much broader one that focuses a lot on civilian counterterrorism capacity building. At the end of the day, we have done a great job in tactical counterterrorism, especially in terms of preventing catastrophic attack on the homeland. We've done a very, very poor job in strategic counterterrorism, in getting ahead of the curve and preventing people from being radicalized. There are many more people radicalized to the point of violent extremism today than there were in 9/11. And across the political spectrum, people are generally in agreement now. We cannot shoot our way out of that part of the problem. The Counterterrorism Partnerships Fund that is run by the State Department and has been running for several administrations now was not only continued by the Trump administration, but was given more money under the Trump administration, is something that is a great example of ways that we can be finding opportunities to give civilian counterterrorism assistance and training that I think demands a lot more attention. The second piece of this, beyond building these alliances in order to move to a partner-led US-enabled model, that we're going to have to deal with is a lot more complicated, and in a time of bitter partisanship is going to be much harder because it involves money and budgets. It might not be great public knowledge, but over 20 years, the quick and efficient way to build counterterrorism, and in particular intelligence counterterrorism budgets, was to build them on top of the kinetic military counterterrorism budgets. So today, it is not the case that if the military decides it's going to be moving military assets, say, out of Iraq or out of Syria or out of Afghanistan to other areas, that the platforms necessary to continue to collect intelligence are necessarily still going to be there. That the funding to continue to collect intelligence will still be there, because those budgets are built on top of the kinetic military toolkits. The military toolkits move, those budgets are going to move too. So we're going to have to go through a very, very complicated and inherently political process of trying to disentangle these budgets. And that's going to require a lot of political will and a lot of cooperation working across the aisle to be able to get those budgets disentangled, so that as we take some of our military assets and array them against other current critical national security threats, we still have the ability to collect that intelligence. Remember, moving from a forward defense model to one that relies on indicators and warning is putting more pressure on the intelligence community, not less. And the final point I'll throw out here is that as I spoke to people, current and former people in the US intelligence community, they feel a tremendous amount of responsibility if we're going to move towards this indicators and warning posture. They're very worried that we say move all or most of our forces out of Afghanistan, and then some plot happens in the homeland that's tied back to Afghanistan. Or we simply don't have the intelligence capability in a particular place because we've moved our assets elsewhere, and the ISR, the surveillance and other types of things that we're doing, which actually does feed into watch listing, falls apart a little bit. Someone is able to get on an airplane and present an aviation threat to the United States, and it's tracked back to the fact that we no longer have the ability to collect and input that information into the known and suspected terrorist list for watch listing as quickly as possible. And so one of the things that I call for in the report is not just making sure that those budgets are disentangled and the intelligence community's budget for counterterrorism remains what it is, but a big upfront investment in artificial intelligence and machine learning and the hardware necessary to support that. To be able to do effective forecasting, we're going to have to invest in the systems to do that. This is a series of really big ideas. It's a really, really big change. And what's hardest, I think, for Americans to swallow is that by definition, it means incurring some level of risk, which we are not comfortable with. But I think we need to look to our European allies and others who've operated this way in a fairly safe manner for quite some time, and accepting the reality that what we have today, while efficient tactically in preventing attacks, is simply not sustainable. And if we start with that understanding, we can then wrap our heads around, okay, how do we shift? What do we do next? Let me stop there and invite first Katrina and then Chris to offer whatever comments, criticism, other ideas they want to throw in, and then we will open it up to the Q&A. I'll remind people if you're on the Zoom, you can populate your questions into the Q&A function. And if you are watching on live stream, we invite you to send your email to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org, and those questions will get to us as well. Katrina, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you for the work that you have done in putting forth this paper, the excellent process that you ran to generate these ideas and refine your thinking on this problem set. There's no question that that the counterterrorism architecture that that's really been in place, that's been built up since 9/11, is overdue for a refresh. And there have been fits and starts of that conversation, as you well know, and as Mr. Costa knows as well, that have been going on, behind the scenes, whether the public was fully witting of those conversations or not. But you sort of ended where I would start, which is this question of what success and failure looks like in the counterterrorism domain is one that it's a conversation that we've never really had as a country. I think very rightly and appropriately after 9/11, there was a national decision that was made that really no one objected to. The never again. Like that was the bar that we set, and quite heroically, our national security apparatus and a constellation of executive branch leaders and lawmakers, resourced that effort, and they were quite successful. We haven't ever had another event like 9/11, and I think there's we need to acknowledge that at the same time that we think about reorienting things 20 years later. The challenge, though, is that I don't know the country is still in the same place. I don't know that never again is still where we are, regardless of the cost, regardless of the trade-offs. I don't think the country is in a place where zero tolerance for any kind of terrorism incident in the United States is what they're willing to have at all costs. And I think that's the conversation, that's a starting place for any real relook at 20 years later. How do we and should we define success and failure in the counterterrorism context today? And then the secondary question, which I think you rightly ask in the paper, is how much is enough? What resourcing is necessary to get us to wherever the national decision is made on what our tolerance level is for this sort of thing. I mean, one of the things that has always perplexed me, having had the good fortune, bad fortune, I don't know quite which way to depends on how you look at it, of being at the National Counterterrorism Center during Benghazi in Boston, was, I've never really forgotten a conversation that I had with then director for NCTC Metals and about the Boston Marathon bombings and how, he and I had this conversation where we marveled at how different the national response would have been if instead of pressure cooker bombs, put into place by, semi-foreigners, it had been white people with guns. A lot more people would have died. The damage would have been it would have been far more lethal of an attack. And the national memory of it and the response to it and the resources that were brought to bear would have been entirely different. And we then saw that play out not far after the fact with the Las Vegas shooting. And when you think about the difference between the national feeling and the emotional response to the Boston Marathon bombings versus that shooting, it's interesting because we have decided as a country that we are okay with some level of mass gun violence, but we are not okay with other types of violence perpetrated by other people, and we resource those two things differently. And I say it, I have my own opinion about where those lines should be drawn, but I think the first order question that the nation needs to grapple with, that shouldn't be the purview of just inside the Beltway Washington policymakers, is what are we willing to accept and what are we not willing to accept, and what costs are we willing to bear in order to have that? It's just a conversation that's never really been had in the country in the last 20 years, and it's overdue. I think the other sort of question that's a first order question is, what has actually been successful? And what should we keep doing and what should we not keep doing? There's a sunk cost to what we've already done in the counterterrorism space over the last 20 years, but not all of the investments we've made have yielded equally good returns on the investment. And yet we've not really had an honest conversation about those tools and which ones are worth, continuing down that path and which ones we tried, but we ought not try again. That too is an important part of this decision-making process about where we create versus where we take risk. I mean, it's very central to kind of the conversation that you're trying to catalyze with this paper. Now, on the question of intelligence, I think you're absolutely right, and I agree with you that as we make these other sort of posture changes around counterterrorism, there's going to be an increased desire to manage that risk or mitigate that risk through intelligence, early indications of warning, that sort of thing. And the way that translates, as somebody who's worked at the intersection of intelligence mission and resourcing, the way that translates is we need more, and not just a little bit more, lots more, and we need to really double down on counterterrorism in order for us to meet these, policymaker requirements. Now, I have to pause and say, I'm not sure that's where I would go. And part of the reason I think that is because I think counterterrorism has been the disproportionate focus of the intelligence community for quite some time, coming up on 20 years. And I actually think there's an awful lot of trade space that exists within the existing capacities that we have to plus up where we need to, and to actually support the heightened need that you would have in a mitigation strategy like that. What I think we're missing to get what the real blind spot is kind of a boring bureaucratic piece of information, which is we don't in the intelligence community have any good data about what we do that's useful and what we do that's not useful. I say we haven't been in the intelligence community for some time, but once you're part of it, you never leave it, as I think what it boils down to. The intelligence community doesn't have any mechanism today to tell you how many people have accessed a report, to tell you who's accessed that report, to tell you even very basic data. They can approximate some of it, but they don't actually, the kind of data that you would want, that any corporation would want to know about, the impact or reach of any of its collection or analytic products, that doesn't exist. And as a consequence of it not existing, we have really, really thin understandings of the relative impact of the things that we do, of the marginal value of adding more analysts versus more collection capacity. These are things that people, you would want them to do it based on, lots of data augmented by some really good, qualitative expertise. But instead, what happens is people are pretty much, licking their finger in the wind and trying to figure it out based on instinct, and it's not ideal. But what it means is that there's an opportunity. If you could harness and understand where your pockets of excellence are, which of our collection capacities is the best athlete for a given problem set, how you could create trade space within, the really vast amount of analysts that cover counterterrorism issues to invest in other parts of the priorities so that you could plug those gaps, you could actually do quite a bit without the kind of major investments that I think your paper assumes. And so I think there's some opportunity there to look under the hood, to kick the tires, and to really try to do more with less, even though that's an unpopular thing to do in Washington. There's two last points that I would make, and then I'm happy to dive in on anything in the question and answer. One is that one of the other gaps in our understanding that I think would be really useful to explore in this moment is we know what we can get from our military and intelligence spending on counterterrorism. We know how far that can carry us because we've lived through it. What we don't know is how far our diplomacy and development dollars could go in countering terrorism overseas. And it's not something we've been willing to take risk and really try in any meaningful way. I think it's a gap in our current understanding. And I think it's an area really worth exploring, because it may turn out that, we get, for every $2 we spend in military spending, we could spend $1 in diplomacy and development and get similar results. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think it's a conversation worth having, and it's probably worth testing. And then the last thing I'll say is that there are some tools in our toolkit that didn't exist 20 years ago. One of them that comes to mind is the Global Engagement Center at the Department of State. I don't think that that's been utilized to its maximum capacity. It was stood up in the final year of the Obama administration. I think it was not staffed by the Trump administration until a full 2 years in. And then when it was, as far as I understand it, the person who was put in charge was, a former Fox News personality, and not necessarily somebody who had the kind of visionary capacity to take it into something really useful. But I think that we have some capacity inside of government to leverage some new tools that haven't really been fully maximized yet. And that's another area where I think we ought to be bringing some creativity to bear on this problem set. So I'll stop there and throw it over back to you. Happy to talk more as the questions come in.
Great, excellent set of ideas. Chris, let me jump over to you before we go to Q&A.
Yeah, Katrina, well done. Matt, congratulations on your paper. And Rob, thank you for having me today. So I'll be brief, but I want to offer a preface and take you back 4 years. On day one of the new Trump administration, we were dealing with 4 problems. We were worried about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and a decision to conduct a raid or not to conduct a raid. The raid was subsequently conducted. We had a pervasive and significant threat to commercial aviation. Commercial airliners potentially were going to be brought down. And of course, we had to accelerate our Defeat ISIS campaign, which really was a by, with, and through model that Matt alluded to that happened with previous administration. In short, there was continuity between the administrations. So I want to make the point right up front. And before I do that, I also want to note there are also hostages that were being held by terrorists overseas, and some of those terrorists were brought home. So those were day one problems. And then the threat has evolved over time. In short, there's not a lot to disagree with insofar as Matt's paper goes, but I will warn what I've said from the day I left the administration, and my warning is about overcorrection, because nobody told me or anybody on my team that we're willing to accept a modicum of risk for attacks against the United States. We felt the pain of a lone actor in New York on Halloween in 2017 when Sapoff killed people on a bicycle path in New York City, something that would have been very difficult to prevent, but that was a failure nonetheless. So that said, as a preface, let me just jump right in and underscore how some of my observations really reinforce some great analysis that Matt provided in his paper. When I left the administration, I immediately had a chance to start reflecting on what I had just been through in the previous year. And someone asked which capabilities for counterterrorism should start, stop, increase, or continue. And I felt to start, we had to begin to recognize and fully process that discrete counterterrorism operations overseas are part of a greater gray zone conflict. And I credited General Votel for really capturing what that battle for influence really meant. And Matt really underscores that in his paper. This idea that great power competition doesn't have to be separate from counterterrorism forces, small footprints, smartly deployed overseas, being in a position to counter malign Iranian influence, for example, but not just Iranians, other actors like Russians. And we had to stop talking about precipitous withdrawals from Syria and think what happened on December 19th, 2018. There was an announcement that mission was accomplished. That's the first time I ever wrote an op-ed, and I did so with Josh Geltzer, expressing a concern that we shouldn't declare victory precipitously. And think where we are right now. We still have forces on the ground in Syria, but I would argue, did we pull out forces precipitously on the ground in Somalia? Small footprints of soft operators working and spending time with foreign counterterrorism partners. Now that seems to be over militarized, my thinking, and very special operations centric, because that is an economy of force. That was not tied to a narrative of forever wars. It was designed to make sure that we had small footprints in place to collect intelligence and work with foreign partners. The last 2 points, I believe, and Matt really gets to the heart of this in his paper. We have to increase building, cultivating, and developing different kinds of long-term partnerships. Like what? Partners to help us with counter-radicalization, a bigger cadre of civilians overseas working on development issues. In the last point, and I'll beat the point again on small footprints of soft operators deployed, we want to continue that because it works, and it has worked historically, and it'll continue to work. If I have any point of contention at all, it's just the idea that domestic terrorism and counterterrorism, it's possible that we can get to an either or proposition, and we can't afford that. We have to focus on domestic terrorism. We have to continue to focus on jihadists, because the ideology has never been satisfactorily addressed by any administration. The Obama administration, the Bush administration, the Trump administration, and certainly the Biden administration has to contend with this new dynamic that's playing out in the United States. But we have to get to the heart of the grievances, and we never did that well. And the final point on domestic terrorism, and I don't want to sound defensive, but it's true, the 2018 counterterrorism strategy reinforced the importance of focusing on white supremacists, neo-Nazis. Never before did we focus on those kinds of dynamics playing out in the CT strategic environment, if you will. But we did recognize that the dynamic was evolving and it was changing. And the current administration is going to have to contend with domestic terrorism, and it's going to have to contend with the problems that Matt lays out in his paper. But the idea that we're going to be able to sustain this long term, clearly there needs to be a reconciliation with a changing environment. So I think this was a good start to the dialogue that's probably quietly happening right now with the Biden administration. So those are my thoughts, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you both so much for your comments. I'll just add one quick comment after listening to the two of you. And one of the things I address in the paper is the need for leaders here in the United States from both parties to think about messaging and how we talk about this problem set in a variety of ways. One of which is in not talking about terrorism in terms of victory or defeat, but rather as an ongoing effort. This should not be thought of as in this kind of Cold War binary terms, but as an ongoing effort. And as part of that, we must start talking about resilience. And we have had counterterrorism strategies, all too many, that talk about defeating the enemy, ending terrorism. We are not going to end terrorism, no more than we will end crime. I think the goal should be trying to get it back down to law enforcement levels. But the point here is to build up resilience, which I think, Katrina, is another way to put part of what you were saying in terms of forcing the country to come to terms with what it is willing to accept in terms of risk, what it is willing to spend as it thinks about those risks. The other thing I want to throw out there is I talk in the paper about the need to move kind of just beyond, certainly to do more in prevention, as Chris mentioned, but really to go beyond that and to think about global fragility. The Global Fragility Act required the US government to come up with a strategy, which it did under the Trump administration. And I think we really need to think about that. The strategy comes out and says, listen, we are convinced that we could spend money, if we spent money now to help prevent tomorrow's catastrophes, we could do a lot more good, prevent a lot more bad, and save billions with a B, billions of dollars. It's very, very hard to get people today to spend money to prevent tomorrow's problems. But I think we really, really need to think about that. And I think that touches on some of the things that each of you talked about. Now, if you have questions, I encourage you to either populate them in the Q&A function if you're on Zoom, and if you're not, to send them into the email address policyforum, one word, at WashingtonInstitute, one word, .org. And we'll jump right in. We already have a series of questions in the Q&A. And it's clearly a matter that this is something everybody's paying attention to, because we have a bunch of kind of well-known counterterrorism personalities asking us questions. So we'll start off with one from Ambassador Nathan Sales, who just finished a term as the counterterrorism coordinator and the ambassador for counterterrorism at the State Department. Nathan asks, I'd love to hear your thoughts about reports that the Biden administration is imposing new approval requirements on certain drone strikes. Strikes that previously would have been approved by commanders in the field will now require White House approval. How viable is such an approach in an era of diminished CT resources and policymaker bandwidth? Chris, do you want to start?
Yes, so thanks for the question. It's always good to hear from Ambassador Sales. We worked together in the first year of the administration. So I would answer the question by saying every administration has certainly the wherewithal and the right to review policies. I just would underscore, without getting into the details, a couple points about direct action. First and foremost, as a nation, we never separated this notion of protecting civilians on the battlefield. We consistently ensured as a nation, and everyone should be proud of that, that we would ensure that civilians were protected on the battlefield, that our strikes truly would be precision strikes. But during the Trump administration, at the same time, we wanted to ensure that authorities were pushed down so that decisions that could be perishable on a battlefield, in a dynamic environment, in places where I've been on the battlefield as an officer in a previous life, where those decisions could be made swiftly and quickly with the appropriate mechanisms in place to ensure that there weren't needless casualties. So I believe firmly that the administration did that under President Trump with that particular policy. We don't talk about the details, and a deliberate decision was made to make our CT strategies a little bit more opaque when it came to mechanical decisions on direct action on battlefields. But all that said, I believe the administration has a right to assess it, the Biden administration. At the same time, I would argue, don't dispense with the policy that works. It was efficient, and we ensured that it wasn't overly bureaucratic. And I heard that for the last 4 years from operators across the field who work in CT, who work in special operations. They were very, very appreciative of those particular policy decisions.
Look, for what it's worth, I think we relied too much on drones. Drones are incredibly important. They serve an important function. I do think we need to begin to have a real serious conversation about how much we need to be using them. And for all of our efforts to minimize civilian casualties, these have occurred, and they do help to skew the conversation. They do help to drive radicalization. That doesn't mean that the drone toolkit is not important. It has its place, but I do think that it makes sense to have a review of the terms under which we use it, how frequently we use it, and as part of that, the level at which that decision is made. And I'd like to give the Biden administration, that opportunity to have that conversation. They are, 7-8 weeks in? So they're still having the review, the counterterrorism review that I'm hoping this conversation will contribute to is very much still ongoing. But I think that we need to be moving beyond a counterterrorism strategy that is drones first. And drones will be something that we use when we absolutely have to, but there's got to be a lot of other pieces to this. Of course there are, but it's not like drones are the end all and be all of our counterterrorism toolkit. And I know that Ambassador Sales agrees with that. I'm not trying to put any other words in his mouth. Katrina, is there anything you want to add on this?
No, I think, look, I think I agree with you. I think drones as a first resort has gotten us, somewhere. I don't know it's exactly where we want to be. I think there's a use for it. It's very narrow. And, frankly, I think it's not only the prerogative of the Biden administration to, relook at the policy, as Chris Costa said, but I also think it is appropriate for there to be process required when you're taking lethal action, especially action that can create unintended consequences. So yeah, I'll leave that one there.
Very good. So our next question comes from John Herford. Exactly what kind of counterterrorism resources and deployments do you think have to be withdrawn or reduced as part of the rationalization and sustainability that you think is necessary? How much in dollar and manpower savings do you contemplate? So I'll just throw out there, without getting into dollars and cents, that for at least the last year of the Trump administration, certainly from in the wake of the three big national security strategies, the national security strategy, the national strategy to combat terrorism, and most importantly, the national defense strategy, which made this big declared shift towards great power competition, this conversation has been going on. I know, for example, of one major component of the intelligence community that plays a massive role in counterterrorism, where 40% of the analytical cadre has been redirected to other things. We're talking about some fairly significant shifts, and not just in terms of military hardware abroad. We're talking about very, very significant amounts of money. And the question is, do the large deployments, and I agree with Chris, we're not talking about, not everything is a forever war. I described in the paper our deployments in Africa in support of others. I described our deployments as part of the Defeat ISIS coalition in Syria, 2,000 US soldiers rallying 60,000 local forces as the opposite of an endless or forever war. But we are talking about very, very significant change. But I think it has to be done smart. At one point during the previous administration, the Secretary of Defense said, because of the need to move forces away from counterterrorism and towards great power competition, we are going to significantly downsize AFRICOM. AFRICOM had already been understaffed, and the amount of savings, which I think the cost was something like 0.2 or 0.3% of the DoD budget, was minuscule. Whereas the relative counterterrorism bang for the buck, and I argue the relative great power competition bang for the buck, where China and Russia are both very, very active, made this a misplaced decision as where to carve your savings. So I think we need to think about this very carefully. Let me go in reverse order. Katrina, you have anything you want to comment on this issue?
Yeah. So I just was scribbling down some back of the envelope. You struggle with these numbers, but they're ballpark numbers. We have spent in the immediate wake of 9/11, $260 billion on counterterrorism, and it's ebbed and flowed, and in 2017, 175 billion. So what we're talking now, if you think about that number, right, you're thinking, what do you get for that, for that investment? We've had about 100 people since 9/11 that have been killed by foreign terrorists or foreign affiliates. About 100 Americans have lost their lives, or about 6 per year. And when you think about what we're getting for that, it's really, I think you have to sort of begin to think about our expenditures on counterterrorism as part of, a trade-off conversation, because we haven't thought about it that way since 9/11. It was always this sacrosanct thing that we were going to spend money on, and that's just what it was. But in reality, for $175 billion a year, there's a lot of things that the American people want that affect American lives more than the counterterrorism fight, or at least that they would perceive affect their lives more. And I'm not saying completely shut off all funding for counterterrorism efforts and pivot all of it. But when we think about what we're spending, we in the counterterrorism space tend to make assumptions and start the conversation in the middle of the movie. And I think that it would behoove everyone to step further back and say, what if we didn't want to buy security with this? Are there other things that the American people might want instead of perfect security? Because we could dial in exchange for something else. And I think we never have that second part of the conversation.
Chris, anything you want to add?
I guess I would just very quickly add the point that it is very difficult to calculate the other factors that we don't build into the equation. As I said, I might have misspoke and said we brought terrorists home. We did that too, but we also brought hostages home. That is a feature of the expenditures, bringing hostages home, bringing children of hostages home, also having a presence where you're able to counter malign behavior of the Iranians, of the Syrians, of the Russians. And that gets to the broader issue of your paper. So if we're going to talk about the mathematics of this, there's got to be a completely different calculus, because it goes beyond protecting the homeland from terrorism threats. So we just need to relook the calculus, and it should be looked at, as I said.
Great. So we've got about 11 minutes left and a bunch of excellent questions. So we're going to collectively, the three of us, myself included, shorten our answers and get into as many as we can. Some guy named Nick Rasmussen has a question, former director of National Counterterrorism Center. Is there any way to put greater rigor behind questions of, quote, risk acceptance or, quote, risk tolerance, whether that's linked to potential for the US to be attacked, or whether that's our tolerance for the shortcomings of partners when we lean heavily on the enable part of the approach Matt's paper recommends? I struggle with this because we seem able and willing to be accepting of risk until exactly the moment that we are not. Can any administration break out of that framework? Either of you want to start? I got ideas, but I want to make sure everyone gets a chance here. Now, look,
Go ahead, Matt.
This is the big question. I talk about this when I'm talking about the issue of balancing counterterrorism and great power competition in the paper. You could make this argument, the same thing when you're talking about trying to shift to a more financially sustainable model. You can have a rational and calculated conversation about this until something happens or almost happens, and then there is very little rationality and a lot of emotion. And the only way to be able to deal with that, and you have to anticipate that something eventually is going to happen, right? Not every day is a good day. Then what you need to do in advance is shape the political atmosphere. This is why you need to be talking in terms of resilience. It's why across the aisle, we need people to stop talking about defeating counterterrorism. Chris was talking about the Trump administration's national strategy to combat terrorism. There's a lot of great stuff in there. but it does talk about defeating our enemies. It doesn't use the word end. It uses another type of word about to eviscerate, or very, very strong kind of black and white. And I get it. But that is not helpful if we're going to help the country get to a point where we can make these very difficult calculations about where we're willing to accept risk. As Katrina said, we by default do it with school shootings. There are all kinds of other things with car accidents, right? There are lots of other ways you're more likely to get killed even today than by terrorism. But with this, because terrorism is inherently a psychological issue, it is scary. And the only way to make someone feel less scared is to empower them with knowledge and make them understand. People need to understand this is not now and will never be an existential threat. My 2 cents. Either of you want to jump in?
I'll add 2 more cents on top of that, which is, I think this is actually part of why things like the annual threat assessment testimony is so important. We have, I fully winning of all the reasons why, the DNI probably typically doesn't find it to be all that useful or hasn't in the past. But you need to have these they play a role, these conversations, in a national conversation about what we're doing, what the trade-offs are, and why. And I think the most important thing that the counterterrorism community could do to inoculate itself against the sudden shift back to why didn't you protect us from everything is to say what kinds of things we're prioritizing preventing, mass casualty, highly organized, like directed attacks. That's where we're prioritizing, and we understand that there are going to potentially be lone wolf type things that happen, and we may not be able to protect against every single one of those. But that's the way that we are postured. And this is what the military does this very effectively. It says, this is what the force is here to do. These are the risk areas. And they're very upfront about it. And the thing is that we haven't really ever been willing to say those things or have those conversations. And I think there's definitely a leadership element of it. I mean, it has to be top down. The president has to be on board. The national security advisor has to be on board. It can't just be coming from the counterterrorism community by itself. But it's also a bit more honest with the American people, because there's a certain amount of risk that we've always had, and we haven't ever been without it. And we have had incidents and we've moved on from them, and it's been okay. So I think that we just need to be a little bit clearer and actually articulate for the American people what we mean, so that they understand. And then when it happens, you can point back to that.
Chris, you want to add anything?
No, great question, Nick. You guys did a great job of covering the dilemma and the challenge of managing risk.
Big question. The next question is from Farah Pandith, who I should admit is a PhD classmate of mine. So, that take that as you will. Love you, Farah. Excellent presentation. Thank you for your insights. Can you speak to the other black holes in terms of how we think about prediction? For example, I, Farah, have called for building a cultural listening machine to help us forecast. What else do we need to stand up? I concur what we have is not fit for the purpose. So I'll just jump in and say, I think Farah's point is actually a really important one, in that it's not just for the intelligence community to be able to have to shoulder that burden of forecasting. And this gets to the point Katrina made earlier, actually Chris too, about the need to invest in the diplomacy piece of this. We have people whose job it is to keep their ear to the ground, to understand what's going on in different places. That's not only going to be something that can be done through sensitive sources and methods. And I think that there's a very big contribution that can be made from the diplomatic side, both in terms of understanding parts of the world, and also then in terms of the larger prevention part. A big diplomacy push, I think, could help make up for part of the making of the military piece of this more sustainable. Chris, anything?
No, as a former intelligence officer, I would just argue that it is so difficult to prevent strategic surprise. If you look at history, countries are going to be, despite the investments placed on averting strategic surprise. Countries time and time again are vulnerable to surprise, cognitive bias, et cetera, et cetera. I think artificial intelligence tools, really, I don't want to overstate them, but I think they are going to assist the human being in making the kind of judgments that need to be made, the kind of predictions that need to be made. Certainly machine learning is going to be an adjunct to the process. That's my hope as a former intelligence officer. My caveat is I was never an analyst.
Katrina, anything?
I come at this from a completely different point of view, which is that I am not sure that AI and machine learning and other tools for sifting through mass data sets are central to the IC's future. I actually think that the IC would do better to focus more narrowly on those places where secrets really matter instead of trying to find patterns in other types of mass data sets that may or may not be useful. So I'm skeptical about the future that a lot of people see in the IC. What I think is there is a simpler issue when we talk about forecasting and warning and all of the things that go along with it. We often miss that the place where the IC has the roughest time is actually at the delivery point when it's going over to the White House or to the policymakers. The IC feels like it has warned when it has written anything that supposes that a thing might happen. And I've seen it happen time and time again where the IC is doing this massive search and querying all this stuff. How many times do we tell the White House that this thing might happen? And then they, have this big giant binder of all the times they warned about a thing. And if you have a big giant binder of paper, that you haven't warned. That's not what warning looks like. And one of the things what you've done is you have harassed the policymakers with all of these various possibilities, and you haven't really told them anything useful. And what I think that the IC really needs to figure out is how to communicate with the policymaker in a way where what they're communicating can be received, and how to deal with volume. This is something that, like, my 6-year-old is tremendously good at. Like, she will come and tell me something, and she'll come and tell me again. And then if I'm not paying attention, she will scream bloody murder. And all of a sudden I'm like, what? The IC doesn't do that very well. It just gently nudges, excuse me, here's my report, blah, blah, blah. Like, there's a point at which the IC needs to turn up the volume for the policymaker in a way that cannot be ignored. And the IC doesn't know how to do that very well. Their only tool is, well, we put it in the PDB. And I am just not convinced. I think the IC ought to do invest some time, not money, because this doesn't require any money, in thinking about what it looks like to turn up the volume and how the policymaker knows that they've been warned. Not whether the IC has warned, but whether the policymaker knows that they've been warned.
I'm thinking of the Biden administration officials who are watching us and thinking, great, that's what I need. The intelligence community has a bunch of toddlers. But I hear your point. We're going to take time for one last question, and I apologize. A sign of a good event is you have way too many questions than you can answer. A bunch of the questions, the answers are in the report, questions that are specifically about the report. One person wants to know why I think Hezbollah is worse than any other terrorist group because it's behind me. I don't. It's just that's my last book, and you should buy multiple copies because I have kids in college, and it would do me good. The last question is from Eric Roseanne. Thoughts on how your proposed framework for rebalancing can address longstanding practice of U.S. working by, with, and through partner governments and their security forces, even when those governments and security forces employ divisive policies and aggressive practices against some of their own citizens, thus perhaps creating or exacerbating the grievances that fuel terrorism and violent extremism. From my 2 cents, excellent point, Eric. This to me falls under that issue of global fragility. Security sector reform to me is an important part of a counterterrorism strategy. Governance, delivery of services, these are things that actually make a difference in terms of prevention. And I'll go into that category of things that if we could invest fairly small amounts of money today in training, they could do great benefits, not just over the long term, in the near term too. And yes, we do need to think about how and when and where we partner with others when sometimes the activities they're engaged in are making the problem worse. Also recognizing that sometimes, depending on where and what is happening where, there are cases where we're going to need to partner with people to prevent attacks on our interests or the homeland that are not always savory. And I do think that these can be balanced overall. Last comments on that, Katrina?
Yeah, my institution, the Center for American Progress, we put out a report on securing a democratic world and returning to a values-based foreign policy. And my bias is that we're in bed with some unsavory characters in the counterterrorism space, and sometimes the benefits outweigh the unsavory aspects, but not always. And I think it's certainly time to re-examine that.
Chris, closing comments?
Yeah, it is a significant challenge, right? Working with unsavory characters that are aligned to your interests for counterterrorism is a significant dilemma for anybody that's been deployed, working with some of those actors. The Saudis are tremendous partners in counterterrorism. The Saudis were complicit, certainly in killing Jamal Khashoggi, as indicated by the DNI report that was released last week. So we've got to continue to work on these issues, but I would say at a very tactical level, you can work with your foreign partners and you can put in the appropriate safeguards to prevent people from stepping outside of the lines. I know I've been involved with that myself, so it's doable on a tactical level.
I want to thank everybody who took the time out of their day to join us today for this conversation. In particular, I want to thank Katrina and I want to thank Chris for agreeing to serve on this panel with me. Wonderful colleagues. I really appreciate your input to the report. I wish everybody a wonderful rest of their day. Stay safe. Stay healthy. And I hope this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end. Feel free to reach out to me by email anytime once you've read the report, for good, for bad, and for ugly. The good I share with the other people who put into it. The bad and the ugly is all my fault. Have a great day, everybody. Chris, Katrina, thank you very, very much.